If your creative push has helped you, you can help the show by shopping on Amazon.com. All you have to do is head to yourcreativepush.com/Amazon. That will take you right there, and you can shop how you normally would. A small percentage of your purchases will go directly to helping cover the costs of creating, hosting, and maintaining your creative push. And especially with the holidays coming up, you can make a big difference just by buying the things you were going to anyway. Again, that's yourcreativepush.com/Amazon, and thank you for thinking of the show and for helping out. Your Creative Push, episode 179.
The more you're able to have a single goal at a time, the more it's all going to work.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and my guest today is Jessica Abel. Jessica is an author and cartoonist with a head for organization and systems, abilities she's put to very good use as she's explored how to make creative work with less anxiety and more ease. She works with creative professionals and serious non-professionals to get a clear, strategic view of their ambitious projects and help them get through the woods and that creative transformation that comes on the other side of finishing. And Jessica, first of all, thank you for coming on the show. I know all about that kind of transformation, that good feeling when you're on the other side of doing a big project or even a small project, just kind of getting the courage to do it and then being on the other side of it like a different person, you know?
Yeah, the trick is getting there, I guess, right?
Right. And like you say, the only way is through. So can you talk about that a little bit, about getting through?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, I should say thanks for having me. It's nice to be here. But to get to the crux of the thing is like the job of getting through a big, ambitious project essentially defines what it is to be a creative person. It's not just about expressing yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, there's plenty of people who, I don't know, they do coloring books or whatever, and they're just trying to kind of feel the color and just enjoy themselves. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And it's a beautiful thing. But if what you want to be doing is creating work that is, you know, new in the world and will sort of wake yourself up and people around you and whatever, you have to be pushing yourself. You have to be trying new things and getting better at what you do. And you get better at what you do by doing stuff that you're not good at yet.
Right.
And that's when it really hurts.
Yeah, and I think it hurts so bad, especially for a lot of people listening that want to start this new kind of creative pursuit. Like you said, that's the hardest part is kind of sucking at something, and like it's easy when you're a kid to suck at something because you don't care. You don't have all this life experience of, you know, people putting you down or your brain kind of developing all these voices in your head saying, you know, you can't do this. I disagree
with that because I have little kids and I'm surprised at how much they don't want to be bad at stuff. You know, it depends on the kid. Some kids are just like they'll just dare it all. They don't care. And you know, I mean, there's limits to it in the way there aren't with adults where you can just like stop yourself for years, and kids kind of won't do that. But, you know, not wanting to, part of it is physical danger, of course, but like not wanting to get on roller skates because you're going to look like an idiot, you know, right. Not wanting to play a game that you're not good at, you know, not wanting to lose, not wanting to draw stuff that you aren't going to be good at drawing. I think it's a very natural, basic instinct to, I was shocked by this, but, you know, having a 2-year-old who didn't want to be humiliated by being bad at something. I was struck by that. You know, I think of childhood as being the time when you're just like, whatever. But it's, I'm not sure how true that is, at least not for all kids.
Right. So, well, how can kids and adults kind of learn from that? And how can they kind of push through that barrier of being so far on the other side of the gap?
Well, I mean, there's so many pieces to it and it's so different for different people. At a basic level, though, I think what it's about is humility and understanding that no one gets good at anything without practicing.
Right.
You know, there's no such thing as, you know, what we think of as sort of native genius or whatever is practicing. You know, it's all about practice. And yes, it may be building on some genetic talent. But, you know, even Mozart was practicing his ass off. You know, Tiger Woods, like tons of practice went into that. He wasn't born that way. You know, he had some natural talents that he was building on, but he worked really, really hard. And that's something that I try to tell my kids and tell my adult students, you know, my college students is, You can't, this is why I'm saying like the only way out is through, because it's all about practice. It's all about deliberate practice, which means pushing your abilities and stretching and doing something that you haven't been able to do before. In some ways, I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know, although I do think that all of us sort of imagine that other people have it easier and that it's not really about practice for everybody, but it actually is. But the main thing is your question is like, how can we push through this? If you understand that that's what it is, then you don't blame yourself for not being good at it. And the self-blame is the problem. It's not, the work itself is not like, it is what it is. You are where you are. But the problem is when you hate yourself for it, and you feel terrible and you feel shame. So how do you push through it is you forgive yourself, for being where you're at. And, I was talking to a woman the other day who's a curator at a museum, and she's not new at writing about art and thinking about art. And, she's on track to get her PhD and all this other stuff, right? She's an expert at that. What she's not an expert at is being a museum curator. She's new at that. And she was saying, there's this moment recently when she just kind of looked at what was going, she's like, I just don't know what I'm doing. Like, and it was shocking her because she thought like it would just come naturally, there wasn't anything really to learn, but of course there's something to learn in every kind of job, every kind of thing that you do. I said to her at the time, this is something I've been thinking about a lot in the last year or whatever for myself, what I'm doing these days, is she's playing JV, it's right. Like, you just aren't there yet. And it's okay. You're learning, and you're learning at an intense pace. And it's actually really exciting if you can not blame yourself for it. That stage of learning and seeing and feeling your brain like alive because you're trying all these new things is a really wonderful feeling, as long as you're not like, and that's why I suck,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like they say with learning language is the best way to learn a language is just kind of like throw yourself into like a new country and don't give yourself any outs, like just completely immerse yourself in it. And it's kind of like that.
I've done that twice. I did that moving to Mexico and I did that moving to France, and I learned French and I learned Spanish. So I can attest to that.
Right.
And it's not easy to feel like an idiot. That is not a fun feeling. It's not easy to realize that all the people don't know that you're funny, interesting or anything. They're just like, oh, she's pleasant. She's,
she's trying.
Married to that guy I like, so I'll hang out with her.
Right.
I overplay it. Like, people did know who I was to a certain extent, but like there's just a real limit to what the ease with which I can talk to people. But it's still incredibly valuable, and that is how it happens. It's not necessarily never giving. It's the less outs you have, the faster it's going to go, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so then I know you're a big proponent of systems and systematizing your kind of creative pursuit. So what advice would you give then to make that kind of a transition, I guess, easier?
Well, like I said, I think that the secret to retaining the energy to push through or to do this work, period, is resolving the self-hate issues that come with it. More than actually systems around like, there's a lot of stuff a lot of systems that can help in terms of like what comes next and how do I sit down and blah, 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 blah. But so much of the drag on our activity is like inside our own heads, Mm-hmm. So like a system around that, if that's a problem for, your listeners, and I mean, it is for most people, so I wouldn't be surprised, is to externalize that, to write it down. I have an activity I do with the Creative Focus Workshop called the Should Monsters, where I have my students write down all of the shoulds that run through their heads. Mm-hmm. I should be better at this. I should be finished already. I should know how to do this thing. I should have 6 books published. I should be more experimental. I should be more, blockbuster. I should be more this. I should be more that. Write all those things down and then draw like a crazy monster who says all those things to you. And then you can literally, like, you can throw darts at it or burn it or, or just look at it and be like, that's ridiculous, and feel better,
Yeah.
The other thing I learned recently, which apparently works really well, and I think it works for me to a certain extent, is to speak to yourself in the third person instead of in the first person when you're having these kinds of, when you're in a state of like sort of freak out. You say, something's going on and, you screw something up or whatever, you say, all right, Jessica, that really was terrible. You should not have done that. That was really mean. And that person's feelings are really hurt. And now you need to fix it. So what do you do next? Apparently what this does is it kind of means that you end up treating yourself more like you would treat a friend, as opposed to, and you're always kinder to your friends than you are to yourself. Like when they're in trouble, the friend's like, I'm not good enough. I can't finish this thing, whatever. And you say, oh, come on, you're fine. You're doing fine. It may not be exactly what you intended, but it's working out okay. If you say that to yourself, all right, Jessica, this may not be quite what you intended to be, but it's completely good and fine and like better than the last thing you did. And it's going to lead to the next thing. And this person and that person, the other person also said they liked it and whatever, And so if you use that voice to yourself, that can actually be a functional way of helping you get rational.
Yeah, like both of those ideas, it's like kind of taking yourself out of the situation or taking the situation outside of you. Like I love that idea of the should monsters. And actually in the last episode I was talking about how like in your brain all these questions, like all these resistances are like a piranha swimming around. If you can kind of pluck it out and kind of use your words and say what, like just admit to yourself out loud, like what it is that you're facing, or even write it down, like you said, or talk to a friend about it. And just the act of getting it out of your head, you can kind of pull this like fish out of its fishbowl and just let it flop around next to you. And you see that it's not this piranha, it's just like this little guppy, just like flopping around, and you're like, okay, now I can get to my work. It's sitting next to me.
Well, even if it was a piranha, it's now flopping around and dying.
Right. You've taken the power away.
Yeah, you take the power away, and that's the key: is taking the power away from those feelings. Mm-hmm. I really think that is the secret to it, because the whole thing of like, there's a lot of rhetoric around getting work done that is very aggressive,
right?
Like forcing yourself to do one thing or another, willing yourself to be something or another, and like all of those things can work for a little while, right? Mm-hmm. You can set a resolution January 1st and say, okay, I'm going to make myself sit down and, write 500 words every day. And that might last a week or two, and then it's going to be like every other day. And then it's going to be once a week. And then it's going to be abandoned, because relying on pure willpower is totally unreliable. It's like willpower is such a limited resource. And unless you can figure out other ways to build it into your life that feel less demanding of that willpower, it's not going to work. Like you're not going to get there.
Absolutely. Yeah. The willpower is kind of like a jump start to the system, and you got to find a way to, I guess make it a habit or just make it a part of your daily life.
Yeah. Habit. And, also build systems around like knowing what your next thing is. So you don't have to think about it too hard, that you're not like reinventing the wheel every time you try to do anything.
Right.
There's lots of ways to sort of help yourself. I mean, that's what we do in the Creative Focus Workshop, is like sort of work out a whole bunch of those things and get them in place so that, when you're sitting there, you have the answer to that question.
Yeah. And that brings us right to the workshop. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Like what people could expect from the workshop?
Okay. Yeah. So the Creative Focus Workshop is a 4-week online course that I run. And what it's designed to do is people will walk away with a system that's very, very personalized, like very much around what it is they struggle with, what their projects are that they're trying to finish, what they're comfortable with as far as like using technology or not using technology. It's all very personal in that sense. But it deals with all of these different aspects. So, most people come into the workshop. I mean, nobody signs up for a Creative Focus Workshop without being in pretty desperate, panic about getting their work done, right? And so I start them with just looking directly at their project list and saying, what is it that you want to do? Even though this is kind of premature in the system, I feel like I need to like address that anxiety that the students are coming in with immediately. So we do that first. But then as soon as you start looking straight at that thing and saying, yes, I intend to do this thing, that's when the should monster comes out, right? Mm-hmm. So we spend time immediately after. So the first week is really, what is the project you want to work on? What are your goals? And then the second week is, what does your real life look like? What are the things internal to you and as part of your daily life that are holding you back from doing that? And then the fourth week, we we get back to sort of brass tacks, and it's like, how do you break down a project into a way that feels really doable and that is understandable in some sense? How do you make the right decisions about what to spend your time and energy on? And we created a literal system. So like, using Asana or using a bullet journal or using whatever. So like whatever people want to use, the actual manifestation is not that important. It's like, what do you put in it? Like, how do you approach that part of it? Then the final week is sort of moving forward. So how do we take what we learned and put it into something that will support you in the future? So you don't just have this beautiful bullet journal and then never look at it again, but that you have this sort of source of energy and help that sort of help, goes on into the future.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the hardest things then, we've already been talking about that a little bit, is how do you get that momentum to keep going then? Because I've seen it so many times in myself, in friends, and also listeners, that they start something, they have the best intentions, and like you said, after, January 15th, things start, slowing down until it trickles to nothing, and then those original resistances come back in where it's just, yeah, I'll get to it at some point. I'll get back to it. Things got too busy. All the excuses come back in. How do you get those wheels to keep turning and to continue to kind of propel you?
Well, I think that's a really complicated question. I'm not trying to avoid answering it, but there's not one way that happens. There are a lot of ways that happens. One of the things we talked about is this idea of dealing with the resistance, like at a psychological level. The should monsters and that kind of stuff. That's a real thing. That is an actual tactic that will help you get your work done. A lot of times people get to week 2 of this creative focus workshop and they're just like, wow, I'm all better. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like they don't need the actual system. Of course they will in the future, but it's like that fixes so much of what stops you, because a lot of times what happens in sort of week 2 or 3 of a project is like, it starts to become real. It's not just an idea anymore. It's not just, like, oh, wouldn't it be awesome if I did a blah, 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 yeah, it'd be awesome. But, it's going to take a lot of actual labor and thinking and devotion and time. And it's going to take a lot of awkwardness too. It's going to take a lot of not really knowing what you're doing and being able to live with that. And that is really tough for people. And so they start having those shoulds and the inner critic, and it's just really uncomfortable. And they really literally don't know what's next either. They look at it and they're like, I don't know how to get from point A to point B on this thing, all of which is totally legit. None of it makes it, I don't want to make this like sound like life is glorious after you get all this stuff together, because there's still plenty of issues, hurdles, and you still struggle with this stuff all the time. But there are strategies for all of these things. Like if you don't know how to move forward in your project, then probably what you need to do is a bunch of work with what I call QTAs, questions to answer, and breaking down the project into action steps and then knowing what your next action is. That's all kind of technical, and I'm like throwing it out there like in this kind of lump. Right. I've written a bunch of stuff on my blog about it, but like the point is that you need to be able to break down what you're doing into parts. And a lot of people don't know how to do that because they've never had to do it. Like, they just start doing, they're like, I want to draw a comic book, and they start drawing something in their sketchbook, and they've never really thought about like, what are the stages of this project? What are the parts that need to happen? And I don't blame them for that, because, where would they have gotten that before? But that's one of the things that might be stopping people when they get to that kind of 3rd or 4th week into a project, and it's like, they suddenly grind to a halt. But there are other things too. It could be one of many different kinds of things, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there's so much fun in learning too, like to not take the things that you don't know as like these like hurdles, but these like small like challenges, and finding like the joy, just the victory of kind of tackling something that you don't know and getting yourself one step further, seeing it as like small victories rather than like small mountains that you have to climb.
Yeah, it's a little of both, right? In a good way. Mm-hmm. It's a little of both. Like they are like mountains, and they can feel really daunting. And if they don't feel like joyful, that's okay. Right. I feel like that's a completely legit way to feel, is that they're not this isn't really an awesome place to be, but it's helpful if you can feel good about it, and feel like, one of the things you can do, the kind of thing you're talking about, is Like, look at that part where you have to learn something in order to move forward as a project in and of itself. So instead of thinking all the time like, oh, well, this is taking me away from my film, the learning thing itself becomes the point. I guess I really need to learn about cinematography. So I'm going to take this course and I'm going to do a little project on cinematography and learn about, framing images or something like that. Then you can have a sense of ownership and completion and sort of joy in the thing itself, and it is getting you closer to the larger goal. Mm-hmm. But if you keep thinking about the time you're not spending on the larger goal, you can drive yourself nuts.
Right. And also finding the joy in like learning that thing, like now you're set. Now you can, not completely set, but you can check that thing off of your kind of list. And that's like a skill that you now have. And the goals can kind of change once you have this new knowledge that you never would have thought about before you had that knowledge. Like you're like, oh my God, I could do this thing. And whatever this thing is something that you never would have known about before. And like, there's something so cool about having that kind of skill set and kind of developing yourself as a creative person that way.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with that. That I think that everything, and I think that's absolutely the case when I was working on my book Out on the Wire, that the things that I was learning from working on that book were enriching the book. They changed the book. Mm-hmm. I could not have made the book I made without having gone through these processes of trying to learn all kinds of stuff,
Right. It's that neuroplasticity. I can never say that you're, mm-hmm. You're always, your brain's always changing depending on who you're talking to, what you're learning about and how you're kind of developing.
Yeah. And for those of us a little bit older, like myself, that is a really great thing in and of itself, right? To keep your neuroplasticity in shape via doing awesome things that are cool and make everything else better. What's not to love, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Except for, of course, the dark forest part in the middle. That's
well, before we get to the book and the podcast, so who do you have that takes your workshop? I know Joey Feldman. He's the one that put me onto you. Great artist, was on the podcast before. What kinds of creative people come to your course?
Really, a lot of people from all over the place. I would say the vast majority are narrative artists of some kind. Or narrative creators of some kind. So not painters or something, although I do have painters and visual artists also. Mm. I also have people who do not identify as artists at all, but do work that has some creative component, like they are bloggers or something along those lines, Mm-hmm. So they don't think of themselves as artists, and maybe it's a business thing and not an art thing, but they're still having to create on demand. And that's really what it comes down to, is like the people for whom the course is the best and the most useful are people who have set themselves the goal of being able to create something on demand, create something self-generated on demand. So nobody's asking for it, and it's not needed unless you make it.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Which is like the hardest thing to do as well, because you don't have anybody pushing you but yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. That's why I think that the work I do on like productivity it feels much more relevant to artists and independent creative people than most productivity work, because most productivity work is like addressing people in an office environment, a corporate environment, who are just trying to like do more with what they have available. It's not really aimed at the independent person trying to come up with something whole cloth. So short answer, mostly narrative people. So including a lot of cartoonists for obvious reasons, because I'm a cartoonist.
Mm-hmm. A very good one.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And a good number of audio people, but also, I had a poet and some academics. I've, had a bunch of people in different, like a playwright, like lots of people in different areas.
I love that, because, we're all kind of suffering from these same creative ailments, if for lack of a better word, these things that hold us back. And that's what I love, having different people on this show. We're all in it together, and I know that you have a sense of, you place a lot of importance on community and, being able to like kind of share with each other too. So I really love it.
Yeah, I really do, because I feel like, I certainly did this by myself, and, that's fine. That's legit. Like, mm-hmm. one can. But the value of having a cohort around, having people who are also doing what you're doing is kind of huge and bigger than I really expected it to be, because people just feel like their suffering is normalized. I guess that's the wrong thing to say, because that means that they accept it now. They don't accept it. They see that everybody else doesn't accept it too, but they see everybody struggling with the same kinds of things and they don't feel like freaks.
Right.
And they understand that there are people who they would look at and say, oh, they've got it all together, and they don't feel like they have it all together. I mean, we've all heard this a million times, but when you experience it in your own life, it's so powerful.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it gets the feet moving a little bit when you can see other people that are kind of walking the path or trying to walk the path and struggling with the same things that you do, that you're all kind of in it together, and it gets the momentum kind of going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think it's really powerful.
So your book, Out on the Wire, and then the podcast of the same name. The podcast is awesome. So for anybody that's listening to this podcast, obviously you listen to podcasts, so definitely subscribe to that one. And we'll have links at the show notes page. But can you talk about, I guess, both the book and the podcast? Maybe the book first.
So the book is called Out on the Wire, The Storytelling Secrets of the New Masters of Radio. And it actually stems from a book that I created back in 1999 with Ira Glass of This American Life.
Yay, Ira.
Which is called Radio and Illustrated Guide. So Radio and Illustrated Guide is a book that is designed to help anybody interested, and not just professional radio producers, to make edited narrative nonfiction radio. So, meaning it has all the steps that go into creating a This American Life show. And even though the thing came out in 1999, it's still very close to what their process looks like today. So the technology stuff is obviously all outdated, but the actual content is still pretty relevant. And this book was something that I got feedback about for years. I would run into people and they would, oh my God, Jessica Abel, you did this book. It's so important to me because I am a radio producer now, or because my brother found it and he became, started making radio, or this was, pivotal for me, or I bought 25 copies and given them away. And it's a book that literally has changed people's lives, which is not something that cartoonists often get to say.
Right.
And it was still selling, even though it was just, and had essentially always just been on This American Life's website. And so I knew there continued to be interest in it. I knew it was being used in schools, in universities teaching, audio and stuff like that. So I felt that I wanted to do more with the book. So I approached Ira in 2011 or so to ask him if he wanted to do another book, or expand radio. And he essentially said, hell no. And basically because he really liked the book, but it had been an enormous amount of work. And he's a busy man. And he's like, oh, no, we're not doing that. But between the two of us, we came up with this other idea to expand out the palette just from This American Life to all, a bunch of other shows doing really, really interesting work that had essentially sort of taken the baton and run with it. They'd taken the essential idea that This American Life had presented and adapted it in so many different kinds of ways. Not that they were descendants of This American Life, because I don't want to give that impression, but that they were, in the same world in a way that there hadn't been anything back in 99 when we did the first book. I really wanted to go from the very tactical side of creating audio, which is Radio and Illustrated Guide. How do you hold a mic? What does a script look like, and how do you edit it? And then, what does editing look like? Those kinds of things, which are all in that book. I wanted to talk about narrative principles and concepts. Why is this work good? Like, yes, this is how you make it, but why is it good? Why is it the best? And so that's what I set out to do. And so I interviewed a whole bunch of top radio producers and podcast producers. And I started the book in 2012. So there was a lot less podcasting than there is now. Mm-hmm. But, everybody there was doing podcasts, but often they were radio first and then podcast later, and just would kind of put their radio shows on the air, which is not necessarily the case anymore. Anyway, that's all beside the point. But so the book, grew quite a bit and just became a really big project. And Radio and Illustrated Guide formed like kind of the preface for it. So you get the kind of tactical part, like this is how it actually works. And then you get the picture of what are the elements of narrative that are important. So we go through things like, how do you build a great story idea? how do you think about the role of characters in a nonfiction story? The importance of editing, and not just editing in the way that we typically think of it, but in the radio edit, which is very, very different beast. That was something that really surprised me when I was working on the book, because I did not realize how huge and
time consuming and taxing and annoying.
Well, but the kind of editing that I mean, I don't know what kind of editing you do on this show, but I knew that editing itself was time consuming. Mm-hmm. But what I'm talking about is the edit, which is the thing where you have 5 to 10, say, people in a room listening to your piece live and then live critiquing you. Ooh. And in the case of something like This American Life, they're all literally on the Google Doc at the same time, all editing.
Wow.
And, the script goes through, word by word edits before it gets produced. So that level, because that they had obviously edited when I was there in 99, but that level of intensity was something was like, whoa.
So intense.
Huge. Yeah. And crucial, absolutely crucial to what it is that they achieve.
Yeah, I can't imagine. The kind of editing I do is just taking out ums and pauses and stuff like that. I can't imagine that kind of a team of people, word for word, really critiquing that. And it's got to be so overwhelming.
It is. And we did our mini version of that for the Out on the Wire podcast. Mm-hmm. It was a fully written, fully edited podcast. My producer would edit, and also my husband, Matt Madden, would edit. So we didn't have the benefit of a whole bunch of people editing. But on one of the episodes, we actually reached out to some of the people in Out on the Wire, the book, Robert Smith and Jess Jang, and they did an edit on one of our episodes, and we ripped the whole thing apart and redid it. I mean, we just had to do it again. They were right. What are you going to do?
Right. And yeah, well, let's talk about the podcast a little bit too, because it's, like you said, it's beautifully edited. Well, you didn't say that it was beautifully edited, but I'm saying it's beautifully edited, and it's really powerful messages about this kind of creative process that I think anybody could definitely gain from. Anybody listening right now should definitely download it. I think. So I know on your 9th episode you said that this was the end, and I don't know if you meant of season 1 or of the podcast. Which did you mean? Probably
of the podcast.
Oh no.
Yeah.
No.
Sorry.
All right. Well, it's okay. Well, you got to make something else.
So let me run over what it is for your listeners, because we're just talking about it in a sort of vague way. But so basically, I took the concept of Out on the Wire, the book, and it is Out on the Wire. The book is also really meant to aim at any reader who is interested in how narrative works. So for their own purposes, or just because they want to know about it. So including writers and cartoonists, and it's for everybody in that sense. But I'm not sure that communicates. It says the secrets of radio. It may be that people self-select out and don't understand what it is, kind of. So when I did the radio show, or the podcast rather, I wanted to explicitly broaden the focus so that people would understand what value this has for their own creative practice. And I also had tons of material that I couldn't use in the book. I mean, I still have tons of material I didn't use in the podcast either, but and there's topics I wanted to get into that were kind of sidebars to the book narrative, but would work in individual episodes over a long period. And then I also wanted to make it really actionable for listeners. And so we created this online group on Google Plus and had people creating their work and getting feedback alongside the podcast itself. So we had 9 episodes that were sequential episodes building a narrative. And those episodes are fully written and fully soundtracked. And you basically were following the model of the kind of shows that are in the book. And my producer, Benjamin Frisch, was just really amazing and did incredible work on that. Then the interspersed episodes. So those came out every 2 weeks when it was live. Yeah, the workshop episodes fell between the main episodes. And in those, we actually took work that was being produced in the workshop group and workshopped it on a live recorded episode. I know from download stats that those get skipped more often than the main episodes, which is fine. But I actually think that those are super, super useful in sort of helping people understand what it is that we're talking about in action.
Absolutely. Some of those were my favorite because they're, like you said, I think they're a little bit more actionable. They're not more actionable, but
it's like
they're entertaining too.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
But so the podcast as it exists has a natural kind of span to it. It has a natural arc, which is creating a narrative project. You you start it, you do these parts, and then eventually you're finished. And so that's a season, right? So we left it open so we could come back and do a season 2 if we want to, but we don't really have a thing that we want to talk about. And I certainly couldn't do another fully narrated, fully written season.
Right.
That just ate my life
much work.
for
right.
4 or 5 months. And I'm really glad I did it. I mean, I learned a ton from it. Just like we were talking about earlier. I mean, this was a prime example of that, just really growing as an artist and as a creative person from doing this work. But that's not my mission in life. So that's not what I'm going to be spending my time on. I could totally see doing more podcasting in the mode kind of like we're doing at some point, like what you're doing right now, interviewing me and kind of more that format. But even that is just, what it's like. It's incredibly demanding. And I just have a lot of other stuff going on.
I got you. Well, whenever you get that idea, you're like, oh, this could turn into season 2. I'm pre-voting. My hand is up right now. I'm voting for yes, do it.
Yeah.
No, but for, before we move on, just anybody listening to this podcast, I promise you will be inspired. I have come up with ideas that I want to do probably 5 years from now from your podcast. I've thought of all these ideas that I want to do. So, it has definitely inspired me. So Out on the Wire podcast, definitely check that out.
Thank you.
Jessica, before we let you go, it's time for the final push. And this is where I ask you to kind of reach to the microphone and grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today and just give them your best final words of advice and really push them to pursue their creative passions.
I guess the one thing that we didn't talk about already, because a lot of stuff that we talked about earlier sort of is that creative push, at least to me, the whole thing of trying to forgive yourself and be kinder to yourself and so on. That's really huge. I guess the one thing I would add to that is the value of prioritization. So I'm learning this myself now very late and struggling with it. But the more you're able to, in your creative life or in any part of your life, any segment of your life, have a single goal at a time, the happier you're going to be, basically. The more effective you're going to be, the more work you're going to do, the more it's all going to work. If you're constantly trying to push 6 or 8 things along, an inch at a time, you're never getting it anywhere. And it's completely depressing and horrible. And even if the projects are things that really inspire you, they're not going to inspire you for long because you're just going to feel like I'm never getting anywhere on this thing. So choosing one thing and putting all of your energy into that thing is the key. And I want to acknowledge here that most of us do not have the option of putting literally all of our energy into one thing because we either have day jobs or families or other obligations or all of the above. Life is real and you can't just be doing that one thing, and that's okay. But in the time that you have allotted and available for creative work, one thing at a time. And a lot of people are going to go oh no, but my film, I can't write my novel and not my film, and feel totally beaten down by that idea. Let me just say this again, one thing at a time. You can do the other thing, but you can't do it right now. You can only do one thing at a time. The joy and the power of having things finished is immense. It just feels so great to be done with stuff and to have it out in the world. Even if out in the world just means with your 10 best friends or whatever, get feedback from people. But often it means more than that. It means that it can be up on your website or it can be something else, and it can help you start making connections and, build relationships around it or whatever it is. Even if it's not that thing, at least you've finished it. It's out of the way. You don't have to think about it anymore. It's not taking up part of your brain. All of those things are really powerful.
Yeah, and it can also build that momentum too. Just having a product, not a product, but having a finished thing that you can a tangible thing that you can not necessarily hold, but just have there and be like, okay, I'm I'm somebody that's completed a project. I'm somebody that has, finished this thing, and you can only have so many plates spinning at once. You just got to finish that, like you said, and get it off of your brain and fully focus on the next thing. Because, if you're a creative person, you've got so many ideas, so much ambition, but to start all of those different things it's a tough thing to do, to keep that all kind of going, and you probably won't finish any of them if you're trying to do all of them at once.
But it's also really tough to stop. Just think for yourself right now. Think about the things that you want to be doing. And imagine saying, I'm only going to be doing my podcast. That's it. I'm doing my podcast. And immediately, I bet you, some other part of your brain's going like, yeah, but what about it? Yeah, but
I just did that. I just did that right now. I thought about how the past year I've only been doing the podcast. I haven't been writing, haven't been doing my music videos, but I've also created a podcast.
Right. You created a podcast. And like at this point, it's possible that having created this podcast, you are like, it is a system now that's in place. Mm-hmm. You don't have to only do this thing.
Exactly true.
It's possible that now you can have another thing, but you can't have two. You can only have one.
Oh, I love it. Jessica, thank you so much for coming on the show, for giving us that push. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Of course. And you can find Jessica on her website. That's jessicaabel.com, jessicaabel.com. You can find everything about the Creative Focus Workshop, the Out on the Wire book, the Out on the Wire podcast, and everything else that she does, including her workshops. I highly recommend you go there. And of course, everything we talked about today at yourcreativepush.com/Jessica Abel. Jessica, thanks again.
Thanks a lot.
A huge thank you again to Jessica for coming on the show. What she said there at the end is so very true. There's so much joy that comes from actually finishing something, as opposed to starting all of these, many different projects and never finishing any of them, or taking forever to finish them. There's so much satisfaction, so much joy that comes from actually finishing. Like Jake Parker said back in episode 79, you want a product, not a project. So when you can set your sights on that one goal and really get through it, as Jessica said, the job of getting through a big, ambitious project essentially defines what it is to be a creative person. So it's choosing one of those big ideas, those big, ambitious ideas that you have as a creative person, and going for it. Once those big ideas get stuck in your head, you're stuck with them, and the only way to get them out of your mind is to actually finish them. And like Jessica so eloquently says, the only way out is through. So I do hope that this inspired you to go and get your work done, to go and get through it. So go and get it done, and go and get through it. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful, productive weekend, and we will see you on Monday if you need the push again. I love you all, and we will see you then. Bye. Never miss a push. Head to yourcreativepush.com/subscribe to find the easiest way for you to subscribe to the podcast.